Hey guys, welcome to another edition of the Bridge HC Online. I am the lead pastor here, Larry Vincent. So glad that you could join us. You know, during his final night here on earth, do you know what Jesus did? He prayed. You can read about it in John 17. And during this prayer, he asked that we as his believers would be as united together as he was with his Father and the Spirit. Do you understand how awesome of a prayer request that is? You know, we believe in what is known as the Trinity, which is basically 3 in 1, right? One God broken down into 3 God, each fully God and yet separate and yet unified. And that unity that he has between himself and the Father and the Spirit, that perfect unity that we really cannot comprehend, is the same kind of unity that Jesus wants his believers, the church, the global church, to have amongst one another. So you would expect that the early church, the church right after, that was formed right after Jesus resurrected from the grave, you would expect that the early church would have been perfect examples of unity, that they would make sure that this prayer that Jesus offered would come to fruition. But if you've read the Bible at all, you know that this was not the case. Satan was doing all he could to divide the church. He was doing it through persecution, through legalism, and also through petty infighting. I mean, just read the New Testament letters that Paul writes and others write. They talk about so many petty infightings. It's ridiculous. And so by the time we get to Paul's letter to Ephesus, which is where we're going to be at today, the book of Ephesians, specifically chapter 4, we see how dangerously close the church was to getting to be severed into 1,000 different pieces. Now, you could say over the last 2,000 years, maybe we've had time to improve this. Maybe we've had time to fix this issue and all the infighting in the church is gone. But let me be honest with you, the modern day church has similar issues that the churches of the Bible faced. But none fare worse for the church today than that of petty infighting. Infighting that leads to division and disunity. I mean, just take a 5-minute drive around town, wherever it is that you might live. Take a drive around town, and you're going to see a ton of churches. A ton of them. Now, as you drive past these churches, I want you to ask yourself, how many times have you seen those churches serve together? How many times have you seen those churches worship together? At the least, how many times have you seen those churches publicly encourage one another? Now, the good news is that even though there is a problem of disunity amongst the churches today, territorialism as I call it sometimes, there is hope for us to do better. And that is what we're going to be talking about over the next few weeks. Now, today, we start a new series that we're calling Called Out. And it's all about how we are at our best as churches, as the church. How we are at our best as an influencer to the world when we decide to put down our pride and to work together. Now, this week, we will specifically look at how we can best work together as the global church so that next week we can look at how we can best influence the world. Make no mistake about it. We cannot influence the world unless we work together. So here's how we're going to tackle today's conversation on working together. 3 sections as usual. Our first section will talk about how God is most proud of his church when we work together. And then in our second section, we're going to talk about how God has gifted us to work together so that we can serve one another and we can also build up the church. And then finally, our third section, we can only reflect Christ the best when we decide to work together. Let's dive right into it with our first section that we're calling a unified representation. And I want to start by reading from Ephesians chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. Here's what Paul writes. He says, "As a prisoner for the Lord, then I urge you to live a life of the calling that you have received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. God is most proud of his church when we make the most of each other. If we want to make an impact in this world, and I believe that we do, I believe the church actually does want to have change in this world, positive change. We must be completely unified. We must strive to be completely unified. But how can we impact the world if we're not influential to it? I mean, think about this. A church with influence, that's impactful. A church with influence can speak into a cultural crisis, can speak into a concern, and actually create change amongst community leaders. That's impactful. But a church without influence, well, they're just annoying. A church that comes out and starts correcting people, and it has no right to do so because it hasn't done the work of unity and it hasn't done the work of respect in its community, that's just annoying. That's like fingernails on a chalkboard, annoying. And let me be honest, we've lost our influence. The church has lost its influence over the world. The world does not listen to us the way that the world used to. And I believe that's because we care less about each other. We care less about people than we do about being right, or being right in an argument. And I got to ask, how can we influence the world if we have no influence within our own walls? If people aren't even listening to us that go to church, how can we expect the people to listen to us if they've never even graced the door of a church? How we treat each other in the church matters. We are called to represent God in a way that reflects his work in our world. That representation, it starts with unity inside of the church. It starts with having a shared passion for Jesus. It starts by having a shared love for the lost. It starts by having a shared connection with one another. Unity happens when we start to respect one another. And that respect, as Paul tells us in these first 6 verses of Ephesians 4, that respect is shown through our humility towards one another, our gentleness towards one another, our patience with one another, and our love for one another. All of this is wrapped up in God's desire for us to live in a way that makes him proud. God is most proud of us when we make the most of one another. And if we truly believe what Paul has written, if we truly believe that there is one God, that there is only one faith and one baptism, if we truly believe that God is over all and through all and in all, then that means he is over us, the church. That means that he works through us. That means that he lives in us. If we believe that, then that belief should be reflected in a church where God is the head, where he is in charge. That should be reflected in a church where God works through all of us, all at once, instead of just a choice few. That should be reflected in a church where God lives in us, constantly transforming us into the image of his Son, Jesus Christ. The unity of the church shows what we think and how we feel about God. if we truly believe that God is one and that he is the center of all things, then it has to show within the culture of the church. And that culture must show itself through love. If we love God and we desire to love others, we must also love ourselves within the church. I want you to hang on to that thought as we head into our first set of discussion questions. If you're new with us here today, welcome. I am so glad that you decided to join us. Here's what's about to happen. You're going to see a screen pop up with 3 questions. You're going to hit pause, and if you're with a group, you're going to talk about either one or all 3 of those questions in about 10 to 15 minutes, or any other question that might have popped up in your head while we were discussing this, okay? If you're by yourself, take the time to reflect on these questions. Take some notes, journal your answers, and really spend some time thinking about how you would respond to this, okay? Now, like I said, you want to spend about 10 to 15 minutes, and when you're done, you're going to come on back and go push play, and then we will start with our second section. Hey guys, welcome back. Look, as our last section told us, God is most proud of his church, of his people, when we make the most of each other. I saw this just about a week and a half ago. The community in which I live went through a tragic loss where a student overdosed. And he was a well-loved student. And this impacted a lot of people who thought that his life was stolen from him, which it was. And as news broke out throughout our community, we saw a response from the high school staff and administration. We saw a response from parents, his parents especially. We saw a response through fellow students and also through other community leaders. And I was able to be a part of the crisis response team for this school, so that we could help them react and go through these emotions that were very normal for them to have after losing such a great person. And as I started talking to these students, and I started talking to the coaches that he was a part of, and I started talking to the other parents, there was this rising concern and anger and passion to start having conversations so that this wouldn't happen again. And I realized, and all these parents that I talked to and these students that I talked to realized that the only way that we can fix this type of problem, the only way that we can really put a dent into the growing overdose problem and addiction problem and drug problem of our school systems is by making the most of one another. Coming together as in a community where students and staff and parents and administration and police officers are helping the entire community to make appropriate steps so that we can make progress, so that we can start doing things and raise awareness so that this does not happen again. It will take the entire community and not just one. Can I tell you that the church has the same call? If we make the most of one another, man, we can do some real good for God, for his kingdom, as we use our individual giftings for the sake of others. That's why we're going to talk about gifting in our second section. We're going to talk about what is our giftings and why that matters for a community. And that's why we're calling this section a gifted representation. Let's continue our text, Ephesians chapter 4, starting in verse 7. Here's what Paul writes. He says, "But to each one of us, grace has been given as Christ apportioned it. This is why it says, when he ascended on high, he took many captives and gave gifts to his people." Now go ahead and skip down to verse 11. We're going to continue there. "So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and teachers to equip his people for works of service so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Now, we make the most of each other when we use the gifts given to us by God. And if you didn't know this, and if you spent any time in the church, you've probably heard this before, but if you didn't know it, let me tell it to you now. Every Christian, regardless of who you are, regardless of what you think about yourself, regardless of what has been told to you in the past, every Christian has a unique gift, which is a pretty cool thing if you really think about it, because God not only saved us, not only did he give us the gift of salvation, but he gave us a gift of work, a gift that is unique, a talent that it speaks to us so that we can speak to other people or serve other people. He gifted us, in Ephesians it tells us, he gifted us with leaders and preachers, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers. And that's just to name a few. This list is not exhaustive, right? It's partial. There are so many other unique gifts that God gives his people, but these are the major ones that Paul wants to bring out. But why? What do you notice about these gifts mentioned in our text? These gifts in particular, they're meant for others. And I believe that all gifts that God gives us are meant for others. These gifts are a means of service to all people, both within and outside of the church. It's a balance. And these gifts are also used as a means of growth in our faith as individuals growing towards Jesus, but also a means of growth to the kingdom as we bring others into God's kingdom and we help lead them into a saving relationship with Jesus Christ. I believe that one of the reasons we have forgotten about unity, because that's what we're talking about here, is because we have forgotten about the unique gifting God has given each of us. Gifting that is meant to help one another. Gifting that is meant to help us come together in community as family. You know, I got a lot of pet peeves about the church today, and one of the biggest pet peeves that I have in the church is when churches care more about their own spaces than they care about working with other churches to share the gospel. Churches are not supposed to be territorial. They're not. And yet, churches time and time again are being territorial. They're not supposed to be. They're supposed to work together for the same purpose, to bring people to the kingdom of God. Now look, I've been accused of this, and I have to tell you, I am not against churches. I love churches. I still go to church on Sunday mornings. Like, I love churches. As a matter of fact, I believe that every church, every faithful church that is faithful to Christ has a role to play in his kingdom. And I know this might seem like a shock to you, and this might be a revelation to you, but churches are meant to attract different people, not compete for the same ones. It seems that every church is looking for that mid-30s to 40 couple who has 2.5 kids and a large income. That's what we want in families, but that's not who we're all. Not every church is meant to attract those people. Some people are meant to attract the older crowd. Some are meant to attract the younger crowd. Some are meant to attract people who are mature in their faith. Others are meant to attract people who are immature in their faith. Each church is meant to attract different people. And once we realize that the church next door is not seeking the same people that I'm seeking, once we realize that, we can start coming together and start to have real progress in this community, in any community in which the church lies. Our God-given gifts should not create competition within us. It should give us purpose for one another and for the world. So we better learn what those gifts are, not just as individuals, but as the church as a whole. What is your church's gift to the community? We also better learn what those gifts do and how we can use them. And we better learn how to use them for the glory of God and the furthering of his kingdom, and not just the furthering of our seats. And can I say, there is no expiration dates for these gifts. Our gifts are to be used until we perfectly reflect Christ to the world. And when we reflect Christ, others will want to be a part of his family too. So what's the end goal then? If it's not to bring more people into our buildings, if it's not to raise more money, right? If it's not to get a better building, what's the end goal of using our gifts for the community? Well, we will serve and equip. That's what Paul tells us. The end goal is to serve and equip until we are unified, until we are knowledgeable, until we are mature. In other words, until we are like Christ, the head of the church. To summarize, we do this until the other side of eternity, because there is no way that any person will perfectly reflect Christ on this side of eternity. We're going to have to wait till he comes back, or until we meet him face to face. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 13 that in this life we are looking as in a mirror dimly, but then we will see him face to face. That perfect reflection will not happen until that moment. So until that moment, we will serve and we will equip, not for our sake, but for the sake of others, working together for the kingdom. Hold that thought. As we head into our second set of discussion questions, go ahead and push pause when they show up, and when you're done, come on back, and then we will continue with our. Hey guys, welcome back. As our last section taught us, every Christian has a gift, a unique gift, meant to serve others and to build up the church. You know, one of the things I love about superheroes, and if you see the graphic that we use for this sermon series, or this conversational sermon series, there are two superheroes, because I believe that what we are called to do is to be sort of like superheroes, but not in a save the world with our superpower kind of a way, but as a team to work together to eradicate evil. You know, superheroes have this tendency to learn throughout their story to work together, especially when this big superpower comes up and tries to destroy the world. They come to this realization that they cannot save the world on their own. They need to team up, right? MCU has the Avengers, the DCU has the Justice League, and VeggieTales has the League of Incredible Vegetables. Go Larry Boy, right? Every superhero needs to work with others if they truly want to eradicate evil throughout the world. Jesus knows that. That's why when he came down to earth, he didn't just save the world or teach people about repentance or about who he was on his own. He gathered together his disciples, both people in the front and people behind the scenes, who helped him accomplish his mission here on earth. He wants us today to continue that model in the church. And that's why in our third section, we're going to be talking about reflected representation. I want to start this section by finishing our text, Ephesians chapter 4, starting in verse 14. Here's how Paul finishes up. He says, "Then we will no longer be infants tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of people and their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. From him, the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work." You know, it is only when we work together that we become most like Christ. Yeah, we can be like Christ on our own individually, but if we're talking about the best reflection of Christ, it can only happen when we work together. Because when we work together, we become stronger in our faith. Paul tells us this. He tells us that better reflections cause us to become more confident in our faith and not so easily tricked by false doctrines or teachings. We are better Christians when we become better reflections of Christ. Why? Because we're better to each other. And when we're better to each other, it causes us to be more willing to be united. If I love a person, I'm more willing to join them and to be a part of what they're doing, even if we disagree on some minor points. You know, this is what drives me nuts about churches throughout history. It seems like anytime anyone's had a minor disagreement, they've split. They say, "Oh well, you don't believe that that music has a part in a church service, so we're going to split and have our own church full of music." Or you believe that every song has to be without instruments, so we're going to split and we're going to have our own church service. Or you believe that communion has to be dunked instead of just taken separately. Or you believe that once saved always saved instead of that people have to work through their salvation for their lifetime. These are things that don't matter in the grand scheme of things. But if I love a person, I mean truly love them, I'm going to be more than willing to love them even when we disagree. And when I love them, then I'm a better reflection of Christ. Can you imagine how many fences we can mend, how many bridges we can build back up after being burned down if our mindset as the global church starts to think of others instead of only thinking of our own congregations or our own buildings in our own community? And not only can we mend those relationships, but we can also be better to the world around us, and we can start being influential to the world around us as we follow Paul's advice to not just speak the truth as he says it, but to speak it in love. Listen, the proof of our unity, the proof that we are actually doing what Paul tells us to do, what God expects us to do, and the proof of our ability to reflect Christ is found in how we love. Yes, how we love the outside world, but in this context of Ephesians chapter 4, the proof is in how we love others in the church. And by loving others in the church, we will grow to be like Christ and to be used by him perfectly. And as we all work together, as our text tells us, we will reflect Christ more and more. People will see Christ in us more and more, causing us to be more unified than we have ever been, causing us to be more influential than we have ever been. So what needs to be done? And I know I sound like a broken record, and this might be a duh statement to you, but the thing that we have to do is to be unified, to live up to God's expectations of the church, to be about each other, regardless of the name that's outside the church building. We have to be about each other. We have to be willing to work together. So here's some practical things that you can do starting this week. Number one, live in a way that makes God proud. In other words, be humble, be gentle, be patient, be loving. And if you have a problem doing any of those things, rely on the Spirit, because all those things are mentioned in the fruit of the Spirit. Galatians 5, if you want to read up on it. But not only should we live in a way that makes God proud, but we need to utilize these gifts that God has gifted us with. We have to utilize our gifts for the service of others, for the building up of others, so that the kingdom can grow, so that we as a church, as a global church, can grow. And then finally, we need to better reflect Christ. Not just to ourselves, to one another, and eventually to the world around us. This is what we need to do together as we strive to be the church that God has called us to be. This is going to lead us into our final discussion questions of the day, of our time together. So go ahead and take 10 to 15 minutes to answer either one or all three of these questions. And when you're done, come on back and we will wrap things. Welcome back, guys. Throughout our time together, we've talked about the following things. In our first section, we talked about how God is most proud of his church when we make the most of each other. And then in our second section, we talked about how as we work together, we utilize these gifts, these unique gifts that God has given us, meant to serve others and to build up the church. And we led all of that into this third section about reflecting Christ, and that the best way to reflect Christ is by working together. Now, this all leads up to the one thing. And each and every week, as you know, if you've been with us for a long time or any time, you know that every week I like to give you just one thing that I want you to think about. One thing I want you to pray about, to take home, to talk about over lunch or dinner or whatever, and just consider it. Okay, here it is. The church that works together reflects together. We have individual roles. Yeah, we have things that we need to do on our own. But only for the sake of the larger body. Really, God wants us to work within community. The word for church, ecclesia, actually means the called out ones. Not the called out one, the called out ones. We work together for the sake of the larger body. I shouldn't want to be like Christ. I shouldn't want to reflect Christ for my own sake, for my own spirituality, so that I can grow to be admired and to be looked upon as this big spiritual giant. No, that's not what this is about. I should want it so that we can all be like Christ, because when I grow to be like Christ, that means my brothers and sisters alongside of me, my church, they're growing up to be like Christ as well. That means my family is growing to be like Christ as well. My wife, my kids, and vice versa. When they grow to be like Christ, I am more like Christ. We should want to be like Christ so that we can all be like Christ, because it's about the body. It's about the called out ones, not the called out one. Just a few days ago, as of this recording, I was able to visit another church plant in Indianapolis called Indy West Church Plant, and the pastor there, Andrew, has set this thing up in a very similar way to how the Bridge is doing things here in Lizton currently. They have a sermon, and then they have conversation or an activity. They split it up into two sections, and as I visited them and I got to enjoy their congregation, a realization has come to me. And it's something that I've known and I believe, but that didn't vocalize until I started preparing for this sermon. I want them to grow. I want them to be successful. Just as much as I want the Bridge HC to grow and to be successful. Just as much as I want any church that is faithful to Christ to grow and be successful. So what's it going to take? What's it going to take from you? What is your role in the bigger picture? What are you willing to do to work together so we can reflect together? I challenge you, and I hope you take this up seriously. I challenge you to pray through this week. Ask God what your role is. Write it down and start getting to work. But maybe you're sitting here today and you're thinking, man, I don't even know where my relationship with God is, let alone what my gifting is or what I have to do in it. Maybe your part of the role right now is to enter into a saving relationship with Jesus Christ, or to rekindle that relationship that maybe has been gone for a while. If that is the case and you just want somebody to talk to or to pray with you, reach out to us. We have a social media page on Facebook and Instagram. You can direct message us from there. You can go to our website. There's a contact button there. You can even email me personally, larry@thebridgehc.org, and we will, guaranteed, we will reach out to you. We will connect with you. We either continue the conversation over Messenger. We can meet over Zoom or FaceTime or whatever. We can even meet in person. We'd love to take you out for a cup of coffee or a meal, just so we can hear your story and give you some practical and loving advice without any judgment. But I tell you what, the best thing that you can do is the long-term commitment. And we have a way for you to commit to that, and that is by showing up each and every Tuesday and just enjoying the conversations that happen around individual tables, about 3 to 4 or 4 to 6, and just surrounding yourself by other people who get you, who understand you, who want to talk with you. And then you can ask your questions right then and there. You can be a part of the conversation live. We meet each and every Tuesday at Tri-West Middle School in Lizton at 6:30 p.m. If you're too far away from that, or if you just can't get to the school in time, or maybe you're just not comfortable being around other people, you can Zoom in and join the conversation live. You have to have a Zoom account, but go to online.thebridgehc.org. You can join us. We start streaming at about 6:50. Conversation always starts at 7 o'clock on the dot, so you don't have to worry about that. As long as you're there before 7 o'clock, you can join us whenever. But we have a table leader that joins Zoom, that leads the conversation. And if you don't feel comfortable speaking, you can just mute your mic, mute your video, and just enjoy the conversation and enjoy listening to what is going on. But we do that every Tuesday as well. Or, as you know, because you're right here, you can join us on demand via YouTube. Usually the next day or the day after, we go live on Tuesdays. Okay. Now next week we have a very special person coming in, the new pastor at Cornerstone Christian Church. Scott Cayley will be leading our conversation as we talk about influencing the world and using the text Matthew chapter 28, 18 through 20. So I look forward to you hearing that. So join us next week. But until then, as always, peace, love, and soul.